Hey everyone, welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hansen. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for joining us today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. Today I had one of the most interesting and unique and really deeply touching conversations I've ever had on the podcast, and I had it with Dr. Jacob Hom. Dr. Hom is a clinical psychologist, associate clinical professor of psychiatry at Mount Sinai, and the director of the Center for Complex Trauma. And listeners might remember that we had Stephanie Fu on the podcast earlier this year to talk about her wonderful book, What My Bones Know, and her related experiences working with and trying to heal from complex trauma. And Dr. Hom was the therapist that she worked with, and she detailed her experiences working with him in that book. And so I began the conversation, as I normally do for these conversations, asking Jacob about his personal background and about the work that he does and how he kind of thinks about complex PTSD and these different kinds of trauma. And man, he was not having that one. And I mean that in the best possible way. And he very quickly moved us and moved me from this conceptual, tools driven, how to kind of typical podcast episode that you'll hear in this space. And you've heard me conduct probably many times in the past listening to this feed, into something totally different. And he did that just by being who he was and by showing up in the room as this very whole and authentic version of himself. And I found this conversation fascinating. It's one of my favorite ones that I've ever done for the show. I completely appreciate Dr. Hom for doing it with me. It was super valuable personally. And we did also, along the way, cover a lot of practical material that I think could be really helpful for people who are trying to work with their own painful past. But what I really hope that you take away from this conversation is the feeling of it and the tone of it. So I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Jacob Hom. So Jacob, thanks so much for joining me today. I've been really looking forward to this one.
It's so nice to be here, finally. Thank you for having me, Forrest.
Super happy to. We had a little back and forth of the planning phase where we had to move the podcast, and you were just a total gem about it, so I appreciate it. And I would love to start just by introducing people to you a little bit more, and particularly asking you the question, what drew you to this kind of work, specifically working with trauma?
There's so many variations to this origin story. I didn't want to be a psychologist to begin with. And so I was kind of resistant to it. Didn't like anything I was learning in grad school. Trauma was actually the only thing I did like. And I think it's because I was going to be a monastic. I was going to be a monk. And I was going to, I think that's what I liked most. And then trauma was the only diagnosis in the DSM that we had to memorize that actually acknowledged that suffering was a huge part of what we were dealing with as therapists, whereas everything else was kind of medicalizing it or turning it into a biological condition. And trauma was actually the only place where suffering and travesty was acknowledged. And it turns out that there's really crazy science that happens when you actually see the impact of trauma and stress on the body, on generations, on genes, and all this other cool stuff. So it became a perfect nexus for both the science and the spirituality or the suffering of what people came into the door for. And it stopped me from thinking that I was manic depressive, borderline, narcissistic, OCD, or whatever it is, like whatever we were studying in the DSM every week that I would suddenly have, as we were like going over the symptoms. And it's just like, finally, someone gets that all this stuff comes from pain.
If you don't mind me asking, were there things in your personal background that you were trying to understand through this inquiry?
My of course.
Yeah.
And generationally too, because I'm a Korean immigrant and my mother's a North Korean refugee, and my parents survived Japanese occupation, and Korea's kind of like Poland, where it's just like, it's a hot commodity. It's a hot real estate property and everyone wants a piece of it. And even now, like the US won't leave like the most coveted land in the center of Seoul. So there's like ancestral trauma that gets passed down in the way that my parents live, in the way that they parented, and the survival strategies that they try to teach us, and then the dysregulation that might have happened as a result. The other really cool thing is that if you are not healing and growing as a result of the work you're doing, then I think you're doing therapy wrong. Or you're going to be bored with the work, maybe. I don't know. It's just going to become a job and it's going to become mechanistic. But I welcome the fact that it's a humbling process to keep learning about how to help people heal and benefiting from it at the same time.
Yeah. So you're already highlighting that there are different ways that, of course, like there are, an infinite number of difficult experiences that a person could have in the course of their life. And there are different ways that trauma can show up for people. You mentioned intergenerational trauma, the ways in which we kind of hand these things down over time. And so I'm wondering how you kind of conceptualize those differences and how the differences between them can show up for people in terms of their experience.
I don't conceptualize.
Okay.
I don't like that
What do you
question.
mean by that?
I'm sorry.
Great.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The way I work is that I look at what happens now, how you enter my room, and then I work out from there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we might weave a narrative that has to do with intergenerational trauma or contextual trauma, but that process of meaning making it's part of it's an exercise. It's not the goal and it's not the truth. Sorry, I know that sounds very vague.
No, I think this is really interesting.
I'm trying to get at how do we get away from a conversation that's going to get us stuck in ideas and in our head into a true felt sense of what we're dealing with and how to be present for what it is that people suffer. And if we are going to use the head for that, then I use the head for understanding what's happening in the moment with a person. How do they come into the room? Like you have such a wide range of presumptions or states or ways of entering a room or entering a relationship. And since I'm a therapist, I'm the constant. And then I see like hundreds of people. And so I have this huge like collection of possible ways. And I try to make sense of the patterns of the way people show up, both when they walk into the room, but then when they're activated, when they're vulnerable, when they're hurt. All these notions of rupture is what I'm getting at.
Mm-hmm.
How they leave.
Rupture, repair. Yeah.
Yeah. How they leave moments of connection. And that's what I'm obsessed with. So all this other stuff, which is really important and true, the contextual, the intergenerational, I only care about how it shows up with my patient in front of me in the moment that I'm with them and how it impacts me.
Yeah, well, then just to ask you about this, doctor, I'm not a clinician. I'm just somebody who talks to people like this about this kind of stuff. And I've tried to become educated about it. But I don't have that kind of experience really sitting with somebody doing that work in a deep way. And my limited experience around it is that it can be helpful for people sometimes to be able to kind of have a box to put their experiences into, or a framework to sort of, conceptualize what's happened to them. Like you were talking about at the beginning, it was helpful for me to understand that these things were coming from pain and it wasn't that I had this label of borderline or whatever. And so that kind of like a conceptualizing process, I think can be useful, but I'm just wondering how that shows up more like in practice.
Exactly. So what would happen is that I look for it to show up first. And then you have to combat all kinds of shame and self-consciousness. And that's where maybe the explanations of putting things in a box is an important first step in kind of bracketing shame and self-consciousness. But you're right that sometimes knowing and understanding trauma processes can also help us have more tender, compassionate understanding of why we act the way we do. So it is true that your question, there can be a really valuable outcome to understanding all of these factors. The dilemma that I have, or my counterpoint, is that if we talk about those first, they become reified, they become static, they become a false idol or a place to stop and think you're done, or it's not actually, it's just the first step. If I get it wrong, people will feel misunderstood. If I get it right, they'll feel deeply understood. But both of those are false way stations along this process of self-discovery. And so I'm still hesitant to even go there still, because
Yeah.
I don't want to shortchange the person's own experience of self-discovery.
Is that how you think about this process in general? Like working with past painful experiences, call it, trauma or complex trauma, whatever like the word is that you want to attach to it, the difficult things that we go through. Do you think of it as a process of self-discovery?
Yeah, it's all process. That part is
Mm.
true. The part I'm hesitating on is whether it's just self-discovery.
I'm sure there's a lot else in there. Yeah.
Yes. There's like understanding human nature in general, understanding your parents, understanding other people. And the worry about the word self-discovery is that it also feels like it's trying to get to a truth, whereas I'm still focused on just opening up a process. Like
Mm.
my ideal outcome for therapy is that a person leaves with some useful framework for understanding human function, other people, but they have a tolerance for complexity and ambiguity, and a capacity to like see the best in people, give people the benefit of the doubt, have grace for themselves. So it's all process stuff, not something discovered, but to be in a state of constant discovery, maybe. I don't know. That sounds really hokey.
Well, it can both sound a little hokey and be really true. And I don't know. It's so interesting where we've started here, Jacob. I think that like what I'm attaching to is just how you mentioned at the very beginning how you had a real interest or thought that you might pursue like a monastic life, a serious engagement with that kind of meditative practice or whatever. I don't know the tradition was that you were interested in, but where you thought that that would kind of be your leaning, and then you end up going to medical school and becoming extremely
Wow.
credentialed, like you have a very impressive CV, the whole thing. But just the way that you talk about this is quite artistic. Like it is quite open and spacious, and I don't know if I'm finding the right words here, but I hope you kind of get what I'm saying.
I know, and I feel like you're outing me in my academic job, and like my they're going to kick me out for not being academic
No, you're
enough or
you're you're a
something.
secret artist, doctor. You're a secret artist.
I
It's
always
great.
have been. I've always wanted to
Yeah.
be an artist, but I couldn't
Mm.
as a first generation immigrant. I
Wow.
couldn't do that to my parents.
Is that something that you've had to reconcile on some level inside of yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I couldn't go into a museum all throughout college because I felt that the paintings were accusing me of forsaking them. And I went to Brown because I thought that I would be able to take classes at RISD, but the schedule never worked out. And so I felt like I had disappointed and betrayed my first love.
Mm.
And then I chose psychology because it felt artistic. I paint pictures with my patients. I tell them what I see. I tell them I see things visually, and I surrender to the creative process. And that's the only way to do it in a satisfying way.
Well, for starters, that's really lovely. And I'm thinking of your work specifically with Stephanie in the book, What My Bones Know, and how you're talking about this artistic impulse. And in talking with Stephanie and in reading the book, it felt kind of like, and I don't know how much you want to talk about this specific work with this specific client, but you can broaden it out here. It felt like she kind of came into the room with a lot of that top down stuff that I was kind of coming into the room with too.
Like, oh my God, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
We would
And
have fights about it.
okay, so I'm wondering because a lot of people have that kind of top down cognitive orientation, or the way we conceptualize trauma, we use the word conceptualize, whatever. If you're starting to work with somebody who has that kind of an orientation, what do you do to soften that or kind of bring them into your end of the pool, or do you just go with it?
I do both. I try to give them enough of the science because I can still do that,
Yeah.
but I show them how dissatisfying that is. I say like, that's like a crutch for your mind to catch up to the work that we have to do. But eventually you do have to dive in. And if the mental, if this mental making sense of thing helps you to be ready, then we can try that. But the water's still cold and it's going to be terrifying when we dive in.
Mm.
So I don't forget why I'm doing it. I think that's my greatest strength through the 20 years of practicing this muscle of being a therapist is constantly knowing the intention behind what the moment is and what my intentions are, and trying to uncover what the intentions of the other is.
I'm now thinking about myself because, research is research and all of that. And I was like I think that I popped out a very feeling person. And as many people are, I was rewarded for more kind of cognitive behavior as a younger person. And this for me led to a kind of pushing down or an avoidance of that softer underbelly of my experience for, I think, a long time. And then, just again, speaking personally, when I was able to kind of return to it through my own process of therapy, and I was able to kind of get back to that over time. But when I first did that, it was extremely uncomfortable for me. Felt very vulnerable, very unsafe, very like, oh my God, there's so much in there. What do we do with all of that? And I come from a background where I have a zero ACE score. You know what I mean? I do not come from a particularly challenging background. I had loving and supportive parents, all of that good stuff. So I have to imagine that for somebody who didn't have those things, it's even spookier and even more difficult in a lot of different ways. And so I'm wondering, what do you do, if anything, to help people brave that and be able to go into that part of their experience when they've covered it for a long time in different ways?
You have to show that you're willing to get dirty.
Mm,
You have to be rocked by what is said. The first time I heard someone really tell the gory details of their rape experience, I needed to throw up, and I had chills going down my spine, and I was like, nothing in the manual tells you what to do at this moment here, right?
yeah.
And our stupid profession is so reliant on manualized treatments. I'm like, where in the manual does it say, where's the bucket? Where's the chapter on the bucket?
Sorry for laughing, but yeah, I mean, no, right on.
And so with that person, I had the courage to say, like, I need to throw up. And she said,
Mm,
I know. And it was the perfect thing to say.
mm.
And it helped us to uncover more of the details, and it helped me to brace for more because we shared in that experience together. So it's not the way you do, the way the question is, how do you help someone? The best way to honor how difficult it is to let it be difficult for you too, maybe is what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, I think that's great.
It's, it's, you, oh my God, the stories I hear are unbelievable.
Mm,
I, they, they cause nightmares. They give me nightmares. I have flashbacks to some of the, whenever someone tells their trauma story well, it's traumatizing. It's disgusting,
mm,
disturbing, horrific. And then I know that we're in the good place. I don't avoid it. This is the
mm.
gift for them to honor me with the most atrocious thing that they can. And then I take that and I bleed from that. And then I let it go. I have to grieve it and be horrified by it. And then we process it together, and we let that trauma process us both.
What do you do to let that kind of a thing go? Because, man, I would have a hard time letting that one go.
There's no, see, this is the problem. As soon as you ask, what do? You're already in your head.
Okay.
And you're out of the process.
Hmm. Maybe a better way to ask it then is like, are there processes that you use? Are there tools you rely on? Or
No, none.
no? Yeah, none.
I've tried. In the face of it, nothing works. It's all BS. Self care is BS. Exercise is BS. Nothing
What do you
works.
mean?
I've tried it all. Like in the face of overwhelming grief, there's nothing to do except be doubled over in pain and to just sob
Mm,
until it just like comes out of you. And then it
mm.
comes back in, and like the cup full fills up again. And then you have to cry it out again. And you have to be held while it's happening. I mean, there is a process to it. It's not
Yeah.
a how to, it's just like a surrender to while also feeling loved, being
Mm,
held, being witnessed. That's the hard part. The rituals of past societies have baked in the wisdom of this process, and we're without rituals nowadays. And so then we're looking for self-help solutions when we just need rituals that are shared by community. It's not rocket science.
yeah. Would you mind giving an example of what you're referring to?
About a ritual,
Yeah. Like what could that look like?
it's as simple as just like losing it, as like being of having your ugly cry on, of being drenched with sweat and tears and snot while someone's there to breathe for you while you can't breathe. It's hard. I don't necessarily accomplish that in therapy. We get to
Sure.
approximations of it, but there's still some release if done well. Like some, I'm not somatic, like in the true sense, like your partner's being trained in, but
Hmm.
I make sure that the body keeps up with us, that the body is also harmonizing to the story that's being told, and that
Mm.
it's contributing to the song of it. And then there's nothing to be done. I just, there are some times whenever like my patients will share something and I'm like, there's nothing for me to do. You did that just right. And they're like, what's wrong with you? Why are you so weird? And why don't you tell me something useful? I'm like, you did it. I will experience it sometimes, but other times it's just like, I honor it as it's being told.
Mm. So I'm going to. Oh, sorry. There's a little background noise for a second. Just give me one moment. You're fine, but you know.
It's New York. I have my
Yeah,
window
exactly.
open.
What you go. You're great. Don't worry about it. I'm just gonna let it do its thing for one quick second.
I should have told the city. I'm on Monmouth Forest.
Phone the fire department. What's
I
going on,
know.
Jacob? You got it. Come on, man. Just got him on speed dial. God, man, wow. So I want to start by saying that I totally love what we've talked about and what we've been doing here so far. This is fantastic. And the reason that I say that is because you just alluded to my partner, Elizabeth, who is in her associateship as a somatic therapist. And whenever I talk with her about the work that she does with people, she says a lot of the same stuff that you have been saying during this conversation in terms of like, there's an aspect to it where it's all kind of bunk. We try to systemize all of this stuff that we can't systemize. You've got a person in front of you who is deep in the weeds of working through the hardest thing a person can work through. And if you're trying to tell me that there's some procedural checklist I'm supposed to hit here, you are just full of shit. Like you've never done this clearly. And so much of it gets to the relationship that she's able to build with a person as a person and just being in it with them as they're going through this kind of a thing. And I have the in this case cross purposes of a job where someone's listening to this and I'm trying to give them something. But I think that the truth is in what you're describing with it as a process of feeling and maybe feeling through something and being honest with yourself about the experience that you're having. And like you were describing, having it flow through you to the best extent possible, understanding that that is an extremely high bar sometimes, because this is really hard stuff. And so it's just so interesting hearing you talk about this, Jacob, from all of the experience that you have and just kind of like hearing that echoed in some of the things that she said. And, it just highlights how ephemeral this stuff is in kind of a way.
She's really lucky to be training now in this
Hmm.
age where it's more mainstream, even though it's still not endorsed in mainstream training yet. You have to like seek this training outside of graduate school or whatever. Um, all of that is true. And now I get to say that behind it, there's 20 years of practice. There's
Yeah.
incredible amounts of technique and trial and error. And the technique is hidden in what do you do when you, how do you get someone to that place of surrendering to the suffering? How do
Yeah.
you, how do you note when it's present but not being acknowledged in the form of a rupture, like whenever there's reenactments happening in the room? How do you call out when people disappear, or when they're, how do you manage the aggression that I invite? Because it's also part of the process of like bringing in the reenactments or the dissatisfaction and all that stuff. And then how do you also manage love in the room? Because I think that the work requires a sense of love being in the room, defined as like a communion of two human beings bearing witness to something painful together, while not letting that turn into anything more erotic, more counter-transferential, or somehow like lose your bearing. So there's so much to be learned, but it should, on the, when you're doing it, it should look effortless, but it better take you a lot of practice. It's like the best, the peak performers in their sport should look effortless, but you have no idea how many years of practice it took to look that effortless.
I've now listened to probably 3 or 4 podcasts that I could find of you talking with different people and reading Stephanie's book and things like that. And it feels like there's such a relational part to the work that you do with people. And you've talked about it here today already. A lot of the time, and again, this is just my understanding, I'm not a therapist, but my understanding is that you're taught to keep a degree of kind of clinical distance from the person that you're working with to avoid some of the issues that you named, issues of problematic enmeshment or reenactment or something erotic transference, like whatever's going on there, whatever lingo you want to staple to it. Um, and and it seems like so much of your work is driven by this like close and authentic connection to the person that's in the room with you. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that a little bit.
It's a, it's a scary thing. There's a reason
Yeah.
why the profession has just said, let's just not touch that stuff at all.
Yeah, totally. Totally. It's
It's just too
protective. Yeah.
murky. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
way too chaotic, and people are at risk, putting themselves at risk. Let's just not go there. Like, take it off the table. But I found that it stifled the work. And
Mm.
the point is, like, you can still, you use it all. Because if your own body becomes the instrument for knowing what's happening in the room, then um, love and hate both become just signifiers of authenticity. So if I love a patient, it's not because I'm loving them in the way that I normally think of it. It's because we're in the good place. We're in authenticity and poignancy. And that's how I use that as a clinical tool to tell me that we're in the right place. And I also know that, but it's also really important for the patient to realize that when they are vulnerable and authentic and real, it naturally engenders love and compassion from the other. And this is something that most traumatized people do not get. That vulnerability is a very dangerous thing, and you're going to get hurt if you open up. So I'm saying that because my experiencing or experiencing love in the room, when I said it's a signal, I didn't want to also take away from the fact that it's also a true human response when someone is authentic and deep,
Mm.
and expressing their pain in an authentic way.
For people who have gone through traumatic experiences of different kinds, complex or otherwise, is there a stifling of what you're describing? That poignance, that
Oh,
authenticity,
good
whatever.
Lord. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trauma basically just makes you, puts you in a box, compartmentalizes you, You become a fixer, a pleaser, whatever those archetypes are that people talk about. You lose connection with what you really feel. You dissociate, you numb out, or you just become dysregulated, or you're lost in old patterns of reenactments. So the whole process of therapy with me, at least, is I try to help you see when you're like kind of in the weeds of trauma reactivity and try to convince you that it's safe to like not be in that with me, at least just with me for now. And then you can go back into that very comfortable, cozy, protective trauma response if you need to. But to practice going in and out of like love and fear, presence and I don't know, compartmentalization.
So it's kind of the word I've heard Peter Levine use is pendulating. There's a
Yeah,
movement in and out of it. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that word, but I didn't want to.
Drop the lingo. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. One of the things that I've just really heard you talk about that I found very resonant in my experience is how you work with anger and the ways in which you seem to support people in feeling very rightfully, comfortable with the anger associated with the experiences that we've had, as often something that we can kind of try to regulate out of people or push down.
You're right. I'm hesitant because my relationship to anger is morphing. I'm learning more about it.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
Originally, my proposal was that anger, we do a disservice to anger as a society because we universally think it's a bad thing. But if we are being true to the idea that our body is just giving us another useful signal, then anger is often the energy that is saying that something is not right, something bad is happening, and I want you to protest this. I want you to fight this. And I'm going to give you the energy to fight off this thing that's causing harm or doing something bad to you. In that sense, we have to heed the wisdom that is, or the perception and the wisdom that anger is affording us of what's happening in the environment or in the relationship. Um, that's the way that it can be useful, and especially for trauma. Um, a lot of patients have that natural angry reaction to being abused, but in fear, they're not allowed to experience it. And so reclaiming the capacity to be angry is an incredibly important step for a lot of people. Um, it's saying you did not deserve this. This was not right. What happened to you was not right. So it's reclaiming self-worth in a way through anger, in a visceral way. Your body is saying this is not right. You deserve better.
Hmm.
Um, and then there's anger is again a very very dangerous experience because it can take over the body and it can cause us to lose our humanity or lose the humanity of the other person. It can be part of the fear response and cause us to create tribalism and violence, obviously. So it has to be tempered. We have to honor what it's trying to teach us, but still decide very thoughtfully what we do with the energy that it provides us.
Hmm.
We still have to stay in control. And then the other thing that I'm personally working on is the anger that just comes out of being dysregulated and tired and hangry. Because I have a young child,
Hmm.
and I was like losing my patience with him because we both had COVID, and I couldn't nap because the COVID wasn't as bad for him, but he and I were quarantining together, and so I had to be with him for 14 hours a day, and my poor brain couldn't do it. If you've ever read Sapolsky's book, Behave, he does such a great job of talking about how the prefrontal cortex is such a fragile part of our brain that takes up 30% of our calories and has limited resource and limited willpower. And then anger just takes over. And so did this practice of forgiving myself for being angry, knowing that I was COVID compromised, and naming it for my son that I've been very grumpy and apologizing to him and letting him be mad at me for how I treated him. So we have both the dysregulated anger and the just anger. I allow him space to tell me how wrong it was the way I treated him. So finishing like letting his anger find release, serve its
Mm-hmm.
function. And then sitting in the humility of how imperfect and human I am in that process. That's my most recent thinking about anger.
I love that. I mean, there are some things that we're still figuring out how to talk about in the mental health self-helpy world generally, and I think that anger is like toward the top of that particular list, where it's just really hard to talk about it because there's so much yes and in it that you're kind of speaking to and what you're describing here, how like yes, reclaiming the aspects of it where they're powerful and motivating and moving. And one of the things that Elizabeth's mentioned to me is that, you know, I would rather work with somebody who's angry, who's pissed off, than somebody who is more sad and depressive, because there's more motion to the emotion. You can move it somewhere. It creates an energy in the room that can be used. And at the same time, exactly what you're describing. It's maybe our most destructive emotion. It leads to a lot of problematic behavior out in the world. I mean, individually in our lives and much broader than that.
The other variable that I would add to what she's saying is whether or not there's a mix of presence along with anger. Because
Mm,
if you're angry and you're just lost in strident outrage, then it's incredibly frustrating. I don't want to deal with that.
yeah. Yeah,
But if
totally.
you're angry and there's heartache as well as anger,
Mm-hmm.
and there's still a, like you're still talking to me as you're angry and you're not lost in it, then it can be a really workable presentation. And
Yeah.
even with
Yeah.
the what she's talking about when people are disappeared, I think that the true variable that's happening is the lack of attunement or presence from the other person, and they're lost in their own despair.
Mm,
But
yes.
sometimes they can be in despair and be poignantly in despair, and then it becomes another beautiful, workable place to commiserate.
I don't know how to ask about or talk about getting somebody to that place of attunement and presencing that you're describing, or helping somebody find it. I don't know if I have the right language because it does feel like such a magical and individualized process. But I
Yes.
am deeply curious how you do that with people. But
Oh,
I don't know if that's an askable question here, if that makes
yes.
sense.
I love that. I don't know how to do it either. Like I've been
Yeah.
asked to write a book, and there's a part of me that says, no, if you can put my ears on a page, then I would be happy with that. But not my mouth. My mouth is useless in this regard.
Oh, I love that. That's a great line.
Yeah, I was gonna make the book just be 300 blank pages and say like I just
Did the publisher not like that? They
no,
weren't so into that?
but it was gonna be like you write your story to me, and imagine that I'm reading this. But so, what's the point here? Yes, how you help someone get into it is that one, you have to do your own work of knowing when you're in presence or when you're in a fear-based survival reactive or fear reactive survival based state of mind, and you can feel a difference.
Hmm.
And you have to like metabolize your own shame around that if you have any shame around that, and realize that it's just like you're the two halves of you operating healthfully. And then because of the way we're designed, we can tell when someone is in fear or in presence if you really listen with your heart and your ears and your eyes or whatever. So then once you can tell, then you have to learn what you can say to help them to see it. And this is where the rupture repair model can be a useful, like a proving ground or a training ground for this. But it has to be authentic to who you are as a person. It can't be trite or um, prepared, because then that's also not coming from a place of presence. So there are sometimes when I do it very well where I'm like, what are you feeling right now? As a, like a general cliche thing to say. But there are other times when I say, I'm not feeling this. This doesn't feel authentic. This doesn't feel real. What is going on in you? Are you really feeling this as you're speaking? Or what is this? Is this a performance? So there can be more like high risk, explosive ways to do it. Um,
Hmm.
and sometimes it works. And sometimes nowadays, the people who come to me know what to expect. So they kind of forgive the blundering attempts. But if you're not prepared for it, it feels very offensive. And it's definitely not something you do in a casual party or like in casual conversation. It's impolite to bring this stuff up, to make it, to make it explicit, to make the process explicit.
You take risks as a clinician that I've essentially never heard anybody else talk about. Some of which are detailed in Stephanie's book, moments where you intervened around a thought she was having, or I think that the explicit example was like calling her stupid or something about something that she said, which became a whole thing because people sort of didn't have the right context for it. But just what you're describing here, where you were talking about um, asking somebody in the room in a moment, like, wait, is that actually how you feel? Are you being honest with me right now? This seems inauthentic. Or you said another time saying to somebody, "Oh, I'm just really bored. I'm just bored right now." For starters, that's ballsy.
And it doesn't come out, I don't say it in those ways. So
Yeah,
it's
sure.
couched with a lot of tentativeness and an apology. And it's scary. It's really hard to work this way.
Yeah, and I'm wondering the care you have to have with doing that, which I'm sure you have.
No, it's the care is there, but it's also, um, I have an image of myself like like a small part, an inner child part that just feels so ashamed of making a mistake, and then having to just put my arm around it and saying like it's okay, you did your best and it didn't work, and there's still like you still do some good things, like some good comes out of you. You're not all bad, and there's a lot of you have to allow yourself to be crushed whenever it doesn't work. I can't always be careful.
Oh, it's such a lovely image for starters. Do you do that kind of is that sort of parts work, for lack of a better phrase, a part of what you do with people
Oh yeah,
regularly?
I
Or
love it.
yeah,
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 it's really
it's
helpful.
something I've found really helpful personally.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like now best exemplified by internal family systems, but it's been around for ages. Um, and yeah, even the way that I do it, I stumbled through, like the way that Dick Schwartz talks about stumbling through finding it himself. And I said, okay, let me figure out how it works. And so I have my own way of doing it that does feel a lot like I'm doing family therapy with parts and doing play therapy with parts and doing parent coaching with the people. It's all the same things that I've learned through all the years. And the essence of it is learning to be quiet and waiting for your parts to tell you things. So silencing the head and making more room for the body and the heart to speak, and the gut, especially the gut. Um, Learning to know your response to your parts and communicating those responses to your parts. That's something that people often shortchange, or they only have mean, nasty things to say to their parts because that's all they've ever heard and learned from their parents. And so in those moments, they're right to say, I don't know what to say, or they'll say something and then I'll say, no, don't say that. Take that back. I'll say, here, let me take over. Let me say something to your part. And then you just
Okay, cool.
quietly
Yeah.
listen to see how your part reacts to what I say.
And is that how you can kind of start to model a little bit of that different way of interacting with that piece of themselves?
Yeah. But I don't
Yeah.
ever feel like I'm using the word model.
Yeah, I was a little hesitant to use it. I wasn't
Yeah.
quite sure what the right word was, but
Yeah. Me neither. It's like guiding them into a state. It becomes so abstract.
yeah.
Yeah. It's really phenomenal. I love when I'm in that state.
I think part of what we've been kind of dancing around here to put my language on it is just like finding different ways in for people, finding what's real in the room, what's authentic at the room, just like as it's happening. Again, I'm thinking back to the book that Stephanie wrote where she talked about doing Google Docs therapy with you, where you would, record a session, go back and forth, be able to like, edit it or reflect upon it or whatever it was that you were doing. And when I was reading that section, and just from my own perspective, I was like, I don't think that you were trying to invent a methodology. I think that you were trying to find a way in that worked for this person. And that's kind of what it seemed like. And is that like just highly, I don't know, playful individual process, just like a part of what you're doing with everybody?
Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It, again, I was able to play with it because I knew what I was trying to accomplish with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, it's not about the technique, it's about process and intention. And it became a beautiful place for us to look at our own process in a way that was one step removed enough so that shame maybe was kept at bay more. Shame and distance, and then the heat of the intensity of that process.
Mm-hmm.
Especially for someone with trauma, where they're going to think that they're doing it wrong and they're a bad student or a bad patient or whatever, or they think that I'm being too critical and harsh and just trying to criticize them without purpose. All those fear-based reenactments are so like activated when we're looking at ourselves. And so the Google Doc was a way for me to say like, oh, I hated when I said this. This was totally unnecessary. So I'm like being also self-disclosing about mistakes I make, but also saying like, you see here, you see how you turned away from what we were talking about. You see how you went intellectual and you had just talked about heartache stuff and then you immediately go to your head. But I'm not saying that to judge you. I'm just helping you to see your own process, how you're dipping into pain and then you go, and when you can't take it anymore, you go back up into your head. And you can do that as long as it's intentional. And some of the most beautiful moments I have is with patients who share an incredibly painful experience or state with me. And then the next week, they want to just like get my feedback about what handbag they like better. I remember a teenage girl who did that. And I would say to her, I know what we're doing. I like, and she's like, I know. And I go, and she said, thank you or something.
Yeah.
Or there's another patient recently who I said, I know that we just went out of the deep stuff. She goes, I know. I said, I want to acknowledge that I registered that we were going out of the deep stuff. She goes, I know. And like with some, like, am I doing it wrong? Are you like shaming, like reprimanding me? I said, no. I thought that it was like, you're just saying that you had too much and that you needed a break.
Yeah.
And then that became a tearful moment for her because she had never had attuned parenting before. It was always just like, do it my way, or either being unseen or being coerced into things, not having agency in the moment.
Do you think that conceptualizing, cognizing, moving to that, what techniques do you have? What skills can you give me, doctor? Part of it is one of the biggest blocks that we have to being able to interact with this stuff effectively?
No, it just has to be put in its place.
Okay, cool.
It's becomes a false idol. I forget what the Buddhist metaphor is, like staring at the finger that's pointing at the moon or something like that. You have to ask your dad about that.
We should do one of these with him sometime, by the way. He would be feasting right now, but it would also be fun to see you guys spar about some of this. It would be good stuff.
I was trying to fit in a joke about how abusive he seemed as a parent, and you must have bad trauma, but I missed the chance.
I think the only, I mean, I'm trying to weave a joke in here too about how we had very unusual dinner table conversations, but that was about it, Hey, little Forrest, how do you feel about that? That kind of thing. But that's about as bad as I ever got it.
For sure. Yeah, he seems like a really lovely person. And
for sure.
I have patients as well as myself who are big fans of his work.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really lovely to hear. Yeah. Man, this has been such an interesting conversation, Jacob. I'm so
Oh,
enjoyed this. You
good.
put me into such a different headspace than I normally am doing these, which I think is kind of the best suggestion to people about how you approach this or how you think about it. Just like the way that you are in conversation and how like I walked into the room, I think understandably, with something of an agenda. You know, you go in, you want to do a good job, you want to ask the questions that people want to hear the answers to, you want to do the thing. And almost immediately, you subverted that essentially. I don't mean that judgmentally. I just, and you broke it down and you went, okay, well, let's go to the feeling level here, the feeling tone level. And I think that we were able to get there pretty quickly. And it totally changed the nature of the conversation. It became a much more authentic, lived in conversation than me just kind of asking a guest a variety of questions about like, what's it like to work with complex trauma? And that itself, I think, is like such a summary of a lot of what you've been describing here so far.
I know. And right now, what I'm hoping for is that there's a listener out there, and I kind of want to give them a moment of silence to absorb and to tune into whether they're also entering a more spacious
Yeah.
state of just wonder, where it's like we're in a museum right now. It's a little quiet. Like there's so many cool things to look at, and we can take our time and enjoy each painting that comes up.
Hmm.
Oh, if only we had a listener section where they could call in now.
Do the old school radio show
Yeah,
maneuver.
exactly.
Right. Calling in from North Dakota. If you don't mind me asking you a kind of edgy question here, Jacob, do you think that you can be a good trauma therapist without having been traumatized yourself?
Um, the requirements are that you have to have a good relationship to grief, sorrow, and horror. You don't need to have experienced trauma, but you have to be comfortable with the shadow stuff, the really scary, painful side of our experience.
Yeah.
Maybe it'd be better if you didn't have it, because then you don't have to worry about being triggered whenever you start seeing that stuff.
Hmm.
But I think I'm getting to a point. I'm trying to move the conversation to this other point about another Buddhist idea that I've come to conclude that the nature of life itself is this perfectly balanced experience of suffering and love, or it's suffering in the context of love, or something like that. Or it's not equally balanced. Unfortunately, it's like mostly painful with these like blips of joy and laughter.
Yeah.
Sorry, my
Sun
dogs.
through the clouds, the whole thing.
Yeah, the metaphor that I've been using nowadays is that the very experience of delivery and pregnancy is our operator's manual for human life, because it's like all pain, all like unbearable, overwhelming, near death experiences, and you still choose it because the end product is this little pound of flesh that you just cannot love more, and you would do it over again to make another little pound of flesh this beautiful, and then all the pain melts away. Like love is this piercing moment, where suffering is the vast dark universe, and love becomes just these brilliant piercing lights of stars, or I don't know. That seems to be the proportion.
Man. Yeah, I feel like there's a huge amount of variation there, of course, in terms of like people's experience with it. But maybe in part, if you want to go to like the level of just how the brain works, a little negativity bias thing here or there, that's definitely what becomes really salient and in people's experience. And I think that a lot of people are just looking for some kind of a reprieve. They're looking for a little bit more light through the clouds
I
and
know, I
a
know.
couple fewer rainy days.
I don't really want anyone to think that what I'm saying is to take it as a truth. I think it more reveals the fact that I'm working with trauma all day long, and my
Yeah.
personal life is hard. If you have a joyful life, then I'm glad you do, and that's your lucky karmic gift. but it's also like I think the more important point to make is to embrace the suffering, to not fight it, to not push it away, that it's a necessary part of life. It's an unavoidable part of life, like
Mm.
the first noble truth, I guess, and change our relationship to it.
Yeah, something that I want to find a way to ask about here is the masking process that can happen around a lot of this stuff. I think, particularly for people who've gone through really hard things in life, there's often the construction of this exterior that protects those vulnerable bits that we've been talking about throughout. And how, as a therapist, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that part of your job is seeing what's underneath it and helping the person kind of look underneath it over time and become more comfortable with that and it being, less of a painful process. But that's an incredibly hard thing to do.
It's the first step. I think the IFS is correct that the first step is that you actually spend a lot of time with the protectors. You
Yeah.
honor them.
Yeah.
You're like, what a clever boy you are for being so
Totally.
smart, for like being able to come up with these strategies to survive and to not, how could you have kept all of those emotions inside you for so many years? That's incredible. You have such a capacity to suffer. It's amazing. And look at you, like willing to fight back and snap back at someone who's like trying to hurt you. Good job. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Totally.
so you honor them, you give them gratitude. You say the other thing that I love is that they're like your most loyal dogs, pets. You
Mm,
say, I love you. I need you to be with me. I don't want you to, I'm not trying to kick you out of here. I just need you to stand next to me, not in front of me. Let me like, let me like face reality, but you keep my back, protect me
mm,
when I need it, but don't take over. And then, um, so after you do that bit of work, the lessen the pain of seeing the exiles or the hurt inner children or whatever it is. So I kind of wanted to not say lessen the pain. I wanted to say be surrender to the pain of it, to
mm,
to accept that
mm.
it's going to be a brutal, painful experience, but know that it doesn't last forever. No,
Yeah.
know that the
Yeah.
more I have this visual of like when you allow your heart to be shattered, it actually makes it bigger and more flexible, and it can contain more of life's experiences and more love and joy as well. And so you surrender to the whole death of that the death experience of severe pain, knowing that you'll be reincarnated into a greater capacity for living the next moment.
To go to some of the Buddhist philosophy with it, you're relaxing craving a little bit or clinging.
Exactly. I that's why I don't like how questions. It comes from striving and clinging and all that other active energy. Whereas when you said this is changing my state of mind, I think because we're relaxing into presence, not passive in a helpless sense, but just like a relaxed, wondering, leaned back sense instead of sitting forward.
Hmm. Yeah, I literally did that a second ago. That's funny. I was laid back in the chair in a different kind of way than I normally am during these.
Yeah, it should feel like we're on a balcony drinking pina coladas or something, enjoying the mystery of life
Well,
together.
cheers to that for sure.
It's so delicious for a person who's strived and protected and fought their whole life
Hmm.
to get to this place. It's a
Yeah.
miracle for them.
Mm.
We can't take it for granted how important and nutritious and delicious this is.
I'm gonna need some help with this next one here, Jacob. So you can lead this particular horse to water if you find a way to do it. But I'm essentially thinking of somebody who's listening to this conversation right now, who might not have access to a phenomenal clinician who can see them in this experience, relate to them through it. They've got some good friends, maybe, but you know, it just the resources are kind of limited. And I'm wondering for that person, what do you think like helps them sit in that place more often or go through some of these things that we're describing that can be restorative for a person? But I don't really know how to ask this
I
question, if
know.
that makes
I don't,
sense.
and
Yeah.
I have competing answers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Part of it is that I don't think that professional help is necessarily the way to go. There's so many other ways to process this stuff. Like when we were talking about rituals and ceremony or
Yeah.
groups. Uh, but I do love the idea that ideally we don't do this work alone if we
Yeah.
can.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really hard to find people who can sit in and bear witness to horror and grief. So you either find that kind of group, or you also have to learn to shape people to be the thing you need. And that's really
Oh.
uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Right? What's your reaction?
In this moment right now, it's my
Yeah.
I'm waking up. You just woke me up. I was like, oh, okay. Shaping other people. I'm just curious what you mean by that.
You have to say, listen, I know you're trying to be helpful, but you telling me what to do isn't helpful. That's not what I need.
Yeah.
I need you to
Yeah.
just let
Wow.
your heart break with me. Can you just hold my pain without saying anything? Can you just be
Wow.
quiet while still listening? This is really hard for me to share, and I'm so ashamed of myself. If you give me advice, it's going to make me feel like I did it wrong, and it's going to make me feel even more ashamed. And I'm going to close up, and I don't want to close up. I really need you to be here with me.
That's such a third rail for people. That kind of like vulnerable request in that way.
Exactly. That's what we
Yeah.
practice together in therapy. I do it. That's the kind of meta communication. I don't like that word, but courageous conversation that I'm willing to have with people. You try to
Mm.
tune into what your body and your heart really needs, and then say it with love and eloquence in a way that does justice to the poignancy of the request. It's a real bid. It's really hard to do. Most people don't do it, right? They're like, "You're never there for me. You're not a real friend." Like they say it with
Yeah,
accusation.
that's where I'm going. How to doing it skillfully, doing it sensitively, doing it in a way that it can be received by another person. I mean, man,
Well, if you are in anger, then you can't artificially be what I just said. You'd have to change it. You'd have to say,
yeah,
"I'm really pissed off at you for not being there." So you say it, but from a distance still. And underneath my anger, I know that there's longing, but right now all I can feel is anger
yeah.
because I really
I'm
want you
in
to
the
get it
pissed.
right. Yes.
Yeah,
Because whenever I see that, I see Homer Simpson grab Bart. Because
yeah,
like anger's trying to rattle you into presence.
yeah, yeah.
It's not trying to kill you. It's not trying to get like to make you go. It's trying to make you really be here with me. Like, wake up, please. I need you. That's what the anger is trying to accomplish.
Trying to wrap my fingers around something that maybe I should just be opening the hand about. I don't know, but basically, I'm you'll see people have these breakthroughs sometimes where they're just in the cycle, in the cycle, in the cycle around something. And then just something happens. And it's hard to put your finger on what exactly it is that just happened, but something happens. Like my dad will use the language sometimes like a switch is flipped. All of a sudden, things change. And all of a sudden, the person kind of goes from being gripped by the anger or being so wrapped up in the communication that they can't do it to just having the moment where it all comes out the way it needs to come out. It doesn't come out perfectly because it never comes out perfectly, but who cares? It comes out the way that it needs to happen. And I'm wondering just what do you think about that process, which can be such like a mystical and mysterious part of therapy?
My first answer, which I'm just going to throw away because I don't really want to spend time on. I was framing it in like chaos theory and nonlinear dynamic systems theory. It's like a
Well,
tipping
for
point.
starters, love that, but yeah.
It's just a tipping point, like what you're describing as
Mm-hmm.
to seem like such a surprise, But it's actually the way that most organic dynamic systems work. That
Pounding
it's
the
not
rock, pounding the rock. Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But then the more useful response is I, I just had the image of surrender.
Mm.
Pounding the rock is that striving, whereas the surrender will actually loosen the
Yeah.
rock fat, like letting the fingers go again, like you had said.
Yeah.
That seems to be such an important thing for people to learn, to loosen the grip on this process.
Mm.
But it's a paradox because we still have to strive. I don't know how to make sense of that either.
There's a certain serenity prayer-ness to the whole thing.
Yes, there is, but it's a dual state. Oh, it's so interesting because the mind is floating and present, but there can still be like lower parts of you can be striving, but the mind is still free.
I mean, there's obviously just like there's so much here, Jacob. There's so much here. There's if we had another hour, I would ask you about ego and working with that because I think that's kind of part of what you're describing here, that difference between like the drive and which is suffused with clinging and craving and all of the things that tend to lead to suffering versus this other part that is open and expansive and letting go and balancing the dance of these two things.
Yeah, and I don't even want to talk about it. I just want people to know that that's a thing and they need to go
Yeah.
experience that
Yeah.
thing themselves, to go look for it. Yeah, that's the point. It's like, hey guys, there's this beautiful museum that you can enter into that's full of wonder and authenticity and poignancy. Come join us in that space. Be full of amazement and wonder and turn off your brain and just like let your heart be filled up by what you experience and tell us about it when you're out there because it's so cool and the way you're going to experience it is so different and it brings us into our own sacred place too when you share yours. And then we just keep growing closer to each other and closer to, I don't know, divine consciousness, or if you want to go all woo about it.
Go all the way out there.
Yeah.
This has been really phenomenal, Jacob. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this with me today. I
Of
really
course.
appreciated this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was fun. We co-created something lovely, I think.
Today I had just such a unique experience talking with Dr. Jacob Halm about the work that he does with people to help them. God, I don't even want to say recover. Something about that conversation, just like now I'm thinking about all the words that I'm using, and is there a more kind of settled in and true and authentic way to speak about this stuff? And that's what I think really came through with this one. A certain way of being, a way to relate to our experiences, a stance from which to hold them, this kind of lightening up and letting go and loosening the hand around the things that are the most difficult things, the most painful things in a person's life. And at the same time, I thought that it was so lovely how Jacob ended the conversation with this incredibly poignant and I thought really personally touching image of going through the museum of life and seeing all of the beautiful things that are available in it and the feeling of wonder and discovery that is part of that process because man, that feeling is such a huge part of what can sustain self-inquiry for a person. It's definitely helped me sustain some inquiry into myself. And the times for me when that kind of self-inquiry gets hard, and I start to feel like I'm kind of stagnating, or I start to feel like stuff is really tough. I think that stuff really gets hard when I lose that feeling that he's describing, when I lose that feeling of wonder and joy and inquiry and interest in what's going on inside of me and what's going on inside of other people and in the world around me. And so if in this episode there is a lesson of some kind, I think that that's probably the one that I'm going to take out of it. that feeling tone of more presence and authenticity and really sitting in it with another person. And frankly, it's something I'm going to try to take into the future conversations that I have on this podcast when I interview people. So this is going to be a hard one for me to try to recap at the end here, and I'm mostly not really going to try. I'm just going to kind of mention some things that stuck out to me throughout the conversation. Really, the relational nature of the work that Jacob does with people. How much of seemingly, and I'm putting words into his mouth here, but seemingly how much of his own authenticity shows up in the room with his clients. That willingness, like he was talking about, hearing the description of horrible things that had happened to a person. That feeling of like wanting to throw up and sharing that in the moment with the client and letting them see him be rocked authentically by what they said, not in a way where they had to take care of him or those things that sometimes we talk about in therapy where that you want to avoid with your clients, but just truly authentically as like part of his humanity coming to the table in that moment and then being able to see that and go, yeah, yeah, it is that way. Yeah, it is that real. And to really feel seen and heard by another person as such a deep part of the healing process and such just like a key resource for people as they have often, lived lives where they did not feel seen in that or they felt like other people did not care about them in that way. And to see that really reflected in the person who's sitting in front of them. And throughout the conversation, we did allude to some of the common challenges that people with complex PTSD or just, more broadly, people who have gone through really hard things in life. Some of the things that they tend to struggle with or that tend to be key points or issues for them. Jacob talked about shame a lot, and he talked about insulating against shame and finding ways to get some separation from it. Like we talked about the Google Docs therapy that he did with Stephanie Fu, how one of the parts of that that was really helpful was the way that it allowed them to get some space from that and how they could like offer commentary on what had happened in the past without being in the moment of it, where you're so wrapped up in it. And also, as part of that, I kind of said this during the conversation, and he seemed to affirm it, that this was not an attempt to discover a new way of doing therapy. It was much more about finding a way in that worked for the person who was sitting in front of him. And that was really consistent with the larger conversation that we were having throughout the episode that focused on the profoundly individual nature of this work. How, yes, there is enormous technique in it, and that technique is learned through a huge amount of experience that Jacob has developed in really working directly with people. And when you watch the best people in the world at whatever their discipline is, athletes, artists, whatever it is, it looks effortless, but it looks effortless because they have expended so much effort. So, yes, there is technique there. But at the same time, whenever you start trying to systemize, you do A, then you do B, then you do C, something's kind of lost in that. And particularly for something where so much of what seems to help people is being seen in their individuality and their authenticity, like their own unique experience of what's going on inside of them, what they've gone through, and being related to fully as an individual. If they can see you kind of referring back to the systems manual while you're doing the work with them, just something seems to get lost in that process. And I don't have Jacob with me now to offer his views on what I just said, but I would be curious what his take on it is. And that does seem to kind of suffuse aspects of the work that he's doing with people. This deep commitment to a relationality and an individuality of whatever's showing up in the room that day, whatever the experiences are, whatever the emotions are, can they be seen and felt and appreciated for what they are? And one of my favorite parts of the conversation, no pun intended, was when we talked about doing parts work with people and his sort of unique approach to parts work. And how he tends to start by really validating the parts of a person that have kept them protected, that have kept them safe. And I just thought it was really cool how that's where he started, with like seeing the positive function that those parts were providing and really validating that on the way into working with all of the aspects of what make a person a person. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. This was a really interesting one, a really valuable one for me. I hope it was valuable for you as well. If you would like to find more from Jacob, you can find him on YouTube. I'll link to his YouTube channel in the description of today's podcast episode. You can find us on YouTube as well if you're listening to this rather than watching it. And if you'd like to support the podcast, the best way to do that is by subscribing to us wherever you're listening to it now on, or you can find us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And truly the best way you can support the show is just by telling a friend about it. It's the best way that we have to reach new people. Until next time, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.